It turns out if you look at the history of chemistry and you look at what a student studies when they learn chemistry, they never talk about mechanisms of toxicity, mechanisms of environmental impact. So how can someone invent a technology that's non-toxic and doesn't hurt the environment if they aren't taught the fundamental mechanisms, what hurts people and hurts the environment? So green chemistry is that body of knowledge to be inserted in the field of chemistry so that anyone who's inventing a new technology has the skills to do the best they can to avoid hurting humans and the environment. So one of the ways that I look at the world is kind of interesting. Chemistry's been around for about 220, 230 years. One of the ways that I look at is the first century of chemistry, long time ago. I feel chemists were whole people. They thought of something, they studied something, they made something, they studied something, they made something, they studied stuff. And then about 100 years into chemistry, William Perkin was working with coal tar, made some pinkish mauve dye, and said, ooh, I could sell this. And all of a sudden, industrial chemistry was created. And we, as a science, broke into two separate tribes. There was the makers of knowledge, and there was the makers of stuff. And the makers of stuff were supported by growing an economy. The Industrial Revolution happened, so tons of funding to make stuff, sell stuff, make stuff, sell stuff. And the makers of knowledge were trying to get grants and get all these things here, and they went on. Then 1950s, 1960s, Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring. There's the birth of the modern environmental movement. It's not that the makers of stuff ignored it. They didn't even know what was happening. It completely resided in the makers of knowledge. And so while the makers of knowledge learned about mechanisms of toxicity and mechanisms of environmental damage, the makers of stuff didn't even speak the same language. So now that we're in the early 3rd century of chemistry, green chemistry is trying to reunite these two worlds so that the makers of stuff and the makers of knowledge are working in collaboration, not only to accomplish the things that we want to have happen, but to not do the things that we don't want to have happen. Because it's so confusing, this concept of sustainability, this concept of circular economy, this concept of how this gets involved with the economy, we really need to train people. We need to have an opportunity for people to learn more about this, because what I feel is if we train the workforce, then as the world becomes even more critically focused on these environmental issues, which they will, we maintain a workforce to solve those problems and to stay supporting the local economy and the global economy. But more importantly, what I have found is when people understand sustainability, they start seeing it in places that otherwise aren't being seen. And when you can find out that, oh my God, this is already pretty close to being sustainable if we nudge it a little bit to the left. And it's those low-hanging fruit that are the worst thing from a disaster perspective, because if all we did is nudge it a little bit, we can solve these problems. But an untrained workforce won't recognize those little nudges. A well-trained workforce will find where are the easy things. And if we can get the easy things done and continue to work on the hard things, we can make real progress. What's really unique about the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute is that it has this duality in that it's working with industry to try to help address pragmatic problems that are tied critically to the economy. You know, we have these environmental issues, and we need to have industry address these issues, but we're also industry is critical to our economy, and so we don't want this conflict to get to the point where we're causing problems. In fact, it's quite the opposite. If we can be solving problems and growing the economy while solving those problems, that's that 1-2 punch. But that doesn't happen just by wanting it to happen. there are certain skill sets. And so the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute also has the opportunity to interact with the academic community and to reach out to the people that are on the cutting edge of science to anticipate today's existing problems, but perhaps even more importantly, tomorrow's unanticipated problems. And so by bringing these two worlds together, the industrial world and the academic community, to address these issues, can't happen any other way. And I feel that the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute is really leading that charge.